Hey there, friends. Right now on Steam and other stores, there's literally the biggest sale of the entire year happening. And that's why I decided to put together 15 new games that have already come out and are totally worth your attention. So please, support the video with a like right at the start. Let's get into it. Ark Raiders. Pretty interesting and in some ways actually a really promising multiplayer project that recently dropped and generated quite a bit of hype at launch. It's basically another extraction shooter, and not from just anyone but from veterans at DICE. The game itself perfectly embodies what an extraction shooter is, like in its purest form. So, the story goes, the world's ended and it's been taken over by mechanical invaders called the Ark. Kinda like robots. We play as raiders who head to a specific location with one simple task: grab something valuable and get back in one piece. As you can probably guess, you won't just be dealing with those robots. Other raiders are going to mess with you too, and they're way more dangerous since they're real players. You never know what's waiting for you. Another firefight where one of you walks away alive and the other doesn't, or maybe you'll team up with some random teammate on the battlefield and bring the loot back to base together. By the way, I really want to praise the world design separately. This whole post-apocalyptic vibe mixed with 80s aesthetics and the Wild West looks absolutely sick. Plus, the game pays really good attention to sound, which is super important in this genre. Almost every action makes noise that can attract unwanted attention, and the sound itself works just right. So, I recommend playing with good speakers or headphones. Oh, and there's good old progression too. Basically, the more contracts you complete and the more valuable loot you bring back, the better your chances of leveling up your stamina, reducing the noise you make when collecting items, or unlocking access to new crafting stations. Dispatch. If you've been missing original games with interesting stories and concepts, well, heads up that Dispatch came out in October. It's this amazing game that's kind of like a strategy game, and suddenly an interactive movie all in one, from former Telltale Games developers. The main hook is built around, weirdly enough, a comedic take on superheroes. So basically, the story centers on a superhero named Robert Robertson, also known as Mecha Man. Long story short, he loses his power suit in battle, and now, instead of saving the world, he's forced to, let's say, look for an easier job. That job turns out to be a dispatcher, someone whose main task is sending employees to emergency calls when someone in the city urgently needs help. And what makes it worse is that your subordinates aren't exactly model superhero workers. They're a bunch of former villains that this job is trying to rehabilitate. As for gameplay, it's built on strategic management using a global map of Los Angeles. You need to quickly analyze situations as they come up, assess risks, and assign the most suitable agents to tasks. What you gotta consider is that all employees are different. Each one has strengths and weaknesses that affect teamwork and how effective they are during missions. By the way, the voice cast deserves special attention. For example, one of the heroes here is voiced by Aaron Paul. Yeah, that Jesse from Breaking Bad, which for me is a seriously awesome plus. Shame that only 2 episodes are out so far and the rest will come later. But personally, I'm crazy excited for them. And if you're into Japanese aesthetics, you can check out one pretty notable release from this year called Silent Hill F. Honestly, if you think about it, Japan was practically begging to be the setting for a Silent Hill game. And finally, after all these years, the developers made it happen. Despite mediocre optimization, it turned out pretty decent overall. To keep it short, the story of this new entry tells us about a Japanese schoolgirl in a fictional Japanese town in the 60s, where as we progress, we're in for real hell in true Silent Hill fashion. There are plenty of brutal and bloody scenes, and the game tackles themes of growing up, loneliness, and inner conflict through the lens of horror and mysticism. And since we're playing as a schoolgirl, obviously they're going to touch on themes of bullying, sexism, and other terrifying things for a kid from a troubled family. But despite our heroine's age, she knows how to fight. Combat in the game is pretty tough, with emphasis on precise timing for strikes and limited resources. Weapons break, and the character's stamina recovers slowly. Plus, as any proper atmospheric horror should have, the game features well-implemented puzzles, which is definitely a good thing. The game itself takes about 10 to 12 hours to complete, has multiple endings, and overall turned out decent. Shame about the optimization, though. It's pretty rough, but that's the fate of almost all modern games on Unreal Engine 5. Now, this is a really nice indie release that's not super well known, but it caught my attention. It's called Arctic Awakening, and it kind of reminds me of my beloved Firewatch. Except here we play as a pilot named Kai, a man with, let's say, a complicated past and a huge amount of baggage. He's got a companion in the form of a little robot that was court-ordered to him as like a therapist. At first, everything's going fine. You're flying over the Arctic, but then a storm hits, you crash, and lose one of your partners in what's basically hell. So your task is to find them while exploring tons of different locations and talking with your robot helper. Plus, as you progress, you start realizing that the place you've ended up in isn't as simple as it first seems. Though in terms of gameplay, the game won't surprise you much. It's largely a typical modern walking simulator where you occasionally solve simple puzzles. The main focus is on atmosphere, and that turned out solid. Shame the game itself is short, it'll take you about 5 to 6 hours max. But for some people that's actually a plus, since you don't have to spend tons of time on another dragged-out story. Probably one of the hottest games this month that basically everyone's been talking about. It's Battlefield 6. True excellence when it comes to multiplayer shooters, though if you think about it, there's nothing mega radically new in the game. They just finally gave players back everything they loved about the original games in the series, but polished it up nicely. And as practice shows, it works insanely well. The multiplayer in Part 6 is one of those rare places you want to come back to again and again. At least because it feels like real cinema when it comes to destruction, and basically everything happening in this game. When everything around you is flying into tiny pieces and you're right in the middle of that chaos, but you're having fun. In my opinion, that's the perfect description of almost every match. The game also has a single-player campaign. It's not as mind-blowing as the multiplayer, and is added more as a tutorial. However, if any of you were looking for a shooter with good production for a couple evenings, why not give it a go? Plus, at the time of writing this script, not only did they launch the first season, but there's also apparently a separate new mode. Basically, the standard battle royale that everyone's been tired of since Warzone days. So many people weren't impressed. And honestly, I can understand why. At least personally, I can't stand the battle royale genre at all and often skipped it in many games. But Battlefield 6 itself turned out phenomenal, and the peak player count on Steam, plus the reviews from players, only confirm that. Keeper. For fans of indie masterpieces with amazing visuals that aren't really on most gamers' radar, something worthy came out last month too. It's a very atmospheric indie project where you're told the story of a lighthouse that comes to life, magically grows legs, and sets off on a journey to a lonely mountain. Overall, as these games tend to go, the whole story unfolds without any words, usually through the environment, design, and various metaphors, which isn't exactly new in this genre. By the way, the lighthouse doesn't travel alone. It's also helped by an intelligent bird for finding various items or solving puzzles you'll encounter along the way. However, the main character has some abilities too. Since it's a lighthouse, its light affects the environment and scares off a sinister entity that wants to spread across the entire world. And you know what's frustrating? This studio has released other cool indie hits before, like the first two Psychonauts games, but since the publisher is, as I understand it, Xbox or Microsoft, nobody really bothered with marketing. On Steam, the reviews are positive, but there's only about 300 of them, which is super low for these kinds of heartfelt games. If you, like me, love small indie games, I strongly recommend checking it out. Not just for the story, but for the stunning, colorful visuals and unique characters. If you happen to have a PlayStation 5 sitting at home collecting dust, now's the time to wipe that dust off, because a pretty decent exclusive finally dropped called Ghost of Yotei. Yeah, it's from the same developers who gave us that magnificent Ghost of Tsushima game back in the day. Though the action in this one unfolds about 300 years later, and you'll be playing as a woman this time. Her name is Atsu, a mercenary who miraculously survived a brutal massacre of her family, which kind of reminded me of the story from Assassin's Creed Shadows. Except here, the crime was committed by a group of warriors known as the Six of Yotei, and following the classic samurai game formula, and really feudal Japan games in general. Our task is to find almost everyone involved, and get revenge in the most epic way possible, meaning eliminate them. Like in the previous game, you'll need to explore a large and very beautiful open world inspired by real locations in northern Japan, including Mount Yotei. And the order in which you deal with the 6 main bosses, so to speak, is up to you as you progress. Much of the story won't be strictly linear. Plus, our heroine will be accompanied by a pretty stylish companion in the form of Grey Wolf, who will logically help in combat against enemies. And yeah, speaking of that, Atsu, unlike Jin, isn't bound by the samurai code, which opens up access to more diverse combat techniques, stealth, and a wide arsenal where each weapon has a unique moveset and is effective against certain enemies. Basically, if you love typical, Sony games, it's definitely worth trying out at minimum. MIMESIS. Now here's a game where you can, and even should, play with a bunch of friends. Actually, several interesting indie games came out in October where you can do this fully. So, for example, what you're seeing now is another clone of Lethal Company, or Repo for that matter, a co-op horror where the enemy AI copies your friend's behavior, right down to their voices and lines. The premise is this: playing co-op with up to 4 people. Your task is to fix a tram using scrap found on the level. Sounds pretty simple overall, and except for the fact that all sorts of monsters roam the locations, and they can copy voices, movements, even teammates' memories to split up the team and eliminate everyone one by one. And yeah, enemies don't just stupidly repeat your phrases. They remember them in different situations. And if the first time a dummy probably won't fool you, well, the longer you play, it's quite possible that by the 3rd or 4th attempt you'll believe them. Shame though, the game itself is still raw. It launched, as is classic for these co-op horrors, in early access and has some bugs. But overall, to brighten up a couple evenings with friends, it's definitely a good option. Continuing the theme of moving away from big AAA titles to something less known. For example, in August, a very atmospheric indie game called Herdling came out. I'm sure many of you haven't even heard of it, and by the way, that's really a shame. According to the game's story, we control a lonely kid in a post-apocalyptic world. But our hero has his own herd of colicorns. Basically, some pretty unusual cows. The task is extremely simple: traveling through the entire world in different corners, searching for a better place or something like that. Following the classic formula of these projects, the whole story and plot is presented without words, usually through the environment, purely through images or actions. And the gameplay is basically like, a simple shepherd simulator. You'll need to lead your own herd, whistle with a bell so they follow you, push rocks, and solve various puzzles. Like how to get everyone across a river or hide from dangers like landslides or wild animals. The key feature of these games is, weirdly enough, just exploration. It's really not recommended to rush through headfirst just to finish the game quickly because you'll miss all the fun that way. And visually, the game, despite its modest budget, looks way more pleasant than most modern games on Unreal Engine 5, largely thanks to the artist's work, which I personally value way more than technology without any style. In October, a new Little Nightmares game also came out. But there's one thing though. The game was developed by completely different developers. Not the ones who made parts 1 and 2, but by the guys who once gave the world Until Dawn. That's why part 3, while it's a decent game, is definitely weaker than the previous entries. Though the game's concept stayed in place, you're still told the story of 2 small children in a pretty creepy and scary world that they need to escape from. You can do this either solo or with 2 players, but sadly only online. In one of my videos, I said you could do it on one screen. Well, sorry, that's unfortunately not true, my mistake. The gameplay formula stayed the same. We move from one point to another, solve various puzzles with emphasis on co-op playthrough, sometimes fight or conversely run away from different creepy monsters. By the way, the design of those monsters is definitely good. Same can be said about the locations. Dark and atmospheric, but in their own way, eerily beautiful. There's a certain vibe to games like Little Nightmares, kind of reminding you of probably Tim Burton's work. Well, whether to check out the game or not, you decide for yourself. Like I said above, it's weaker than parts 1 and 2, which might turn off fans of the series. But if you haven't played and just wanted a dark co-op fairy tale with a story to get through in a couple evenings, why not? A pretty dynamic game also came out in September, and this one with more focus on space themes and including co-op play called Jump Space. The name speaks for itself. It's a cooperative shooter by design that takes the idea from Sea of Thieves. Except these thieves are now in space instead of at sea, with PvE elements similar to, say, Left 4 Dead. Here we control members of a space crew where everyone has their own duties. Someone takes the pilot's seat, someone monitors systems and handles repairs, and someone focuses on fighting enemies. Though there's no strict assignment of duties, and that's just an example, because you can freely move around the ship and use available equipment as events unfold. Separately, I'd like to praise the game's completely seamless transition between controlling the ship from third person, landing on planets, and going out into open space for exploration or boarding. Plus, planetary missions are a whole separate pleasure. Kinda reminds you of dungeon clearing from various MMOs. Missions are handcrafted, but to add more replayability, they've got random elements thrown in. I'm sure each of you has thought about how cool it would be to buy your own RV and go on a trip with friends. Well, you can perfectly realize everything mentioned above in this new game on your screen. It's a game where you and your friends are heading home from an amazing vacation, but you had to take a slightly different route that includes tons of diverse situations you'll need to find your way out of. In the game, you'll actively need to account for physics, use a winch to climb up a mountain or get out of some hole or cliff, while also needing to stuff yourselves with burgers, drink colon and stuff, yelling at your teammates to coordinate them. And, of course, dividing up responsibilities. One person plays the disaster driver, another fries patties, the third fixes the car, the fourth just messes around and entertains everyone. Honestly, I don't even know what could be better than gathering a bunch of friends, driving around in old junkers and just cussing each other out. Right now, the game's in early access, but it already has around 2,500 positive player reviews and a pretty decent peak player count on Steam. So if you've got people to gather with, I highly recommend spending your next weekend right here. Voyagers of Nera. By the way, staying with co-op games, here's a survival game with your buddies that came out in September. There's honestly no point in talking too much here. It's a typical survival game with friends, where you start on a small island, craft a boat from whatever materials you can find, and then head out to explore the world, surf the waves, find different biomes, build villages with custom houses, farmers, and altars for spirits. Oh yeah, those spirits. You could say they're your key to leveling up different skills. Might they unlock new recipes, cook food, or heal? You'll also be upgrading your weapons, armor, and accessories. Plus, I'd like to praise the visuals. Yeah, it's not super high-tech, but it's very bright and vibrant. The views you come across in the game are definitely nice, which is undoubtedly a plus. Otherwise, it's a typical survival game in early access. Reviews on Steam are positive, so if you were looking for something to kill time with friends, it's definitely not the worst option. Wires and Whiskers. I'm sure many of you know about games like A Way Out, It Takes Two, or the more recent Split Fiction, games with good story campaigns focused on co-op playthrough. Well, something similar came out recently, but it's extremely under the radar. It's a free game that's pretty short and can be finished in one well-spent evening with your friend. Here's the deal. The world's ended. Mutants are roaming everywhere. And you play as a hamster with implants who's magnetically linked to his exoskeleton robot. By the way, that exoskeleton is the second player. Your goal is simple. Get outside by breaking through militia, corridors, and traps. The game has no dialogue, drama, or anything like that. You just plug in a controller and play through the game together on one screen, solving simple puzzles, fighting mutants, and jumping across platforms. The game is super straightforward, both visually and gameplay-wise. And considering it's free on Steam, it's really a sin to complain much. Like I said above, it's just a pleasant project where you can spend time with your friend. Metal Eden. For those of you who've missed intense shooters with super dynamic gameplay, heads up that in early September, a game called Metal Eden came out. According to the game's story, the action takes place in the distant future where humans learn to upload consciousness into robot bodies. So our main heroine is basically an android. She becomes, you could say, the last hope of a dying civilization as she heads into a dark metropolis to save digital copies of people trapped in capsules who then fell under the control of mysterious engineers. That's basically all you need to know about the story, because the key feature here is the gameplay, and that is focused on extremely fast pace, where Our Lady needs to maneuver between enemies using parkour, wall running, gravity tricks, and dashes. Plus, she transforms into an armored ram to smash through obstacles. It strongly resembles either Ghost Runner or the latest Doom games, if we're being honest. And the graphics throughout the playthrough will constantly be full of tons of different effects. So if you love this kind of dynamic, carnage, I recommend checking it out.